to turn it over. David is going to start our program, and Coco and Kristen are going to follow suit. So thank you.
Hello and welcome. My name's David Hoppy, and I'm the author of Food for Thought. It's an honor to be here at the Hull House Museum. Thanks very much for having us here. Thank you. For the past year, Kristen, Hess, and I have been traveling all over Indiana talking to men and women involved with Indiana food. This was a program that was commissioned by Indiana Humanities, which is the State Humanities Council in Indiana. There are humanities councils in all 50 states. And state humanities councils were created in the mid-60s by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, when we say humanities, I think it's a good idea for us to begin by defining our terms a little bit. When we say humanities, sometimes some people are a little off-put by that term, or they're not quite sure what it's referring to. For me, at least, when we talk about the humanities, we're talking about those ways of knowing that help us understand ourselves as individuals, or help us as individuals understand ourselves within the context of the communities of which we're a part. And stories play a big part in the humanities. The stories we tell ourselves, the stories that are told to us, the stories that we share with one another. Stories help us develop a sense of place. They help us retain our memories. And so when we began thinking about this book, Food for Thought, An Indiana Harvest, we decided that what we wanted to do was create something that would be driven by stories, the stories of people who are involved with Indiana food. Now, in thinking about this book, there were a number of things that we realized that we did not want to do. First of all, we did not want to do simply a guidebook. There are plenty of guidebooks that can take you on trips all around Indiana and that can help you find lots of interesting places having to do with food and agriculture. But that wasn't necessarily our intention. Also, the other thing we didn't want to do, we did not want to create a kind of best of. There are also plenty of books like that around, which will tell you what the author's judgments are with regard to what's the best pork tenderloin in Indiana, or where can I get the best pumpkin soup, where can I get the best piece of pie. We weren't necessarily interested in making those judgments, again because what we really wanted to do was find stories. We wanted to basically try to create a sort of composite portrait of what's happening today in Indiana food. And the extraordinary thing that we found was that as we traveled around the state and talked to well over 80 individuals, was that everybody, and I mean everybody, agreed about one thing. They all agreed, whether they were old-timers or newcomers to the scene, they all agreed that this was the most dynamic time that anybody could remember in the history of Indiana food. And we, for example, spoke to a woman named Eleanor Arnold, who you'll find in the book, who has been collecting oral histories of Indiana farm women, for instance, since the 1920s. And Eleanor herself grew up in Indiana, grew up on an Indiana farm. And as far as she's concerned, you know, she can't remember a more exciting time in Indiana food than this one right now. So we began trying to collect stories, and in doing so, we found ourselves having to talk to a really wide array of people. You know, another thing that this book is not. I mean, this book is not strictly, for example, about sustainable or organic agriculture. I mean, there are plenty of people in our book that are representing that point of view, but we also knew that one of the things that's happening in Indiana right now is proliferation of some of the largest agribusinesses in the world. One of the curious things about Indiana, the Indiana food scene at the moment, is that on the one hand you have artisans, small farmers, people who are creating wonderfully developed, thought out approaches to what they grow, how they grow it. But at the same time, you also have some of the biggest agribusinesses in the world who are literally trying to redefine how people think about and relate to food on a global scale. That's one of the things that we think actually sets the Indiana food story somewhat apart, because we know that food is hot all over the country right now. We are living in an era of celebrity chefs. We're living in an era of the Food Network. People are also more concerned about their health than ever before. And they're concerned about the way food impacts their health. They want to know where their food comes from. They want to know how it's been grown. They want to be able, in many cases, if they possibly can, to shake hands with the farmers that grow it so that they know what it is they're putting in their bodies. So food is a big story everywhere. But another thing that we thought creates a somewhat interesting angle for Indiana food is that people have been growing food, have been cultivating food in Indiana since well before the settlement of the state. Native Americans in Indiana were growing food and farming along the banks of Indiana rivers well before there was anything like written history. And one of the subjects in our book, Donnie Tippmann, who is herself of Potawatomi descent, is actually collecting the food stories that have been passed down across many, many, many generations for her people, and actually finally beginning to codify them. So Kristen and I had the great good fortune to go off on this adventure together, and the images that you see there are just some of the images that Kristen captured in the course of doing the interviews with all of these folks. I mentioned small farmers and large farmers. Aster Bakili there, for example, is an urban farmer who's working with disadvantaged kids and actually teaching them how to farm, how to relate to fresh produce, and beyond that, how to be able to prepare it, a skill that's being lost by a whole generation. We also talk to people that are dealing with hunger issues, activists that are trying to fight for the preservation of their rural way of life, as well as academics and food distributors, master chefs, and grill cooks. So there's a wide array of folks. They're pictured in the book, and I'd like to let Kristen Hess tell you a little bit more about how this project began and her own process.
So, can you hear me okay? All right. My involvement with this project actually began about 2 years ago with Indiana Humanities, which is where I work. And we did a 2-year program called Food for Thought that took me all over the state, meeting with communities, gathering together, and using food as a convener to talk about more. It's exactly what you all do every week here. And that was a really amazing process. You know, we found that there were neighbors who were not talking about problems that were very pressing, and that, you know, having a meal together provided that space, that non-threatening environment where people could come together and maybe work something out. It's also a time of education reform, of rural environments really feeling violated. And so, you know, having food as that common denominator was a really powerful process. And as a result, the program was fortunate to win the Schwartz Prize for the top public humanities program in the country. And we thought, you know, this is really something. Why don't we create some kind of a legacy, something to live on? And that's how the book was born. From my end, you know, as we're talking about stories today, David, you know, did the interviews, and we really got to know people. We sat down at their kitchen tables or in the back of their restaurants and just got to know them. What do they believe in? What makes them do what they do? I mean, these are people who do what they do with their hands. They work really hard. And so we wanted to capture the stories and to figure out what are the common themes, what are pulling people together, what do they want. And with the photographic process, I just tried to capture them in an authentic way, you know, doing what they do, try to capture their personalities. I can actually tell, you know, a critique to myself. who I connected with most, or which stories which resonated most with me, based on how much I feel like the picture really captures them. But it was an amazing process, and people oftentimes would pose themselves or want to be represented with certain animals or not others, and that was a really neat process. I think that, you know, people having the legitimacy of seeing themselves in a book. A lot of people we talked to didn't think they should be part of it. I said, oh no, you don't want to talk to me. There's definitely people who do this better. And that, exactly like what David was saying, you know, it's not a best of book. We just wanted to capture regular people. Some, sure, they're winning awards that are recognized all around the world, but others aren't really known, and that was kind of a purpose as well. And so when it came to the design of the book, I wanted that to translate as well. That's why there's so many photos on the cover. And there's actually a couple on your tables if you want to flip through it. But the goal was to make it accessible, to represent the whole mosaic, the whole portrait, as David says. We did maps, so you can tell exactly where people are from. The stories are told in their first-person voices. So it's people telling their own stories. And, you know, that coupled with the photo, the goal is that you feel like you've made a friend, you've gotten to know someone, and some qualities about them that really say something. So that's my perspective on it. Yeah. What do you want to?
I'm just supposed to be the moderator, so I guess I'm going to get up here. Anyway, I'm Chef Coco, and I think you both stated very succinctly your own personal passion and what brought you to this and a lot of what you got from it. But of course, as a moderator and trying to bring in our audience with questions, of course, got some questions for you. Now, was this truly a documentary project or an activist project, or was it a bit of both? Dave?
I think primarily, since it was sponsored by Indiana Humanities, it was a documentary project. Indiana Humanities had a lot of ideas about the width and breadth of the waterfront that they wanted to cover. And actually, I think that made the project a lot stronger, because it meant that we included folks that might not necessarily have been included otherwise, that might have been overlooked for one reason or another. And so I'm really glad, for instance, that I was pushed out of my comfort zone and you know, had the opportunity to collect additional stories. And I hope, because of the documentary nature of the book, you know, my job was to try to capture and evoke, and to whatever extent I could, recreate the voices of the people that were talking to us as they told their stories. And I hope, however you're approaching this material, through the juxtaposition of voices, you can begin to draw your own conclusions about what's taking place.
Okay. Yeah, I would just add to that I think if we're advocating for anything through this project, it's the notion that everyone has stories.
Okay.
And that there's more than what might be someone's occupation. There's something deeper there.
So you were going a lot for the connection that people had with their particular story. But what I wanted to get back with you was inclusion.
Yeah.
How did you go about finding the diverse spaces that I see in this book and the diverse stories? Because as you said, these are stories and people who otherwise would be overlooked, their missions or otherwise.
Right.
And I think you made a very determined choice to make sure that didn't happen, and it reflects. What was the difficulty in you being able to make this as diverse a book and faces as it is?
You know, it wasn't so much a difficulty as it was just a really healthy challenge.
Okay.
You know, I mean,
and what was challenging about all this unhealthy stuff?
Because one of the interesting things about what's happening with food right now is that there are so many different kinds of people getting involved with it. So, you know, there were a number of criteria that we were really challenged to include within the book. I mean, we knew, for instance, that we wanted to cover as wide a range of occupations as we possibly could.
Okay.
We knew that we wanted to create as great a geographic diversity within the context of the book as we could. We didn't want to focus on one particular region, no matter how thriving that area might be. We knew that we wanted to have as much gender and ethnic and racial diversity as possible in the book. Because all of those things are in fact really representative. You need to have that stuff in the book because it's all happening. And so having, you know, those voices on one shoulder, if you will, all the way through this, going, you know, have we looked hard enough?
Okay.
Have we gotten everybody that we could around a particular subject? That was really good. And, you know, sometimes that's why working in collaboration with other people is really useful because, you know, there's always going to be somebody in the back who raises their hand and basically says, what about this?
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. It forces you to, I like the fact that you said it was a healthy challenge.
Sure.
Because I think some of the greatest gifts that we get out of life come from a challenge that we may not have necessarily willingly wanted to pursue. And the information and everything that you can get from going into something that you may not have even thought about before, what you come out with is so much more valuable, I think.
Well, we all have our own interests. We all have our own predilections.
Right.
We know the things that are really fascinating to us. And those stories that really speak to us the most, and so we naturally gravitate toward those things. But that doesn't necessarily enable us to get at the larger picture, and that's what we were trying to do with this.
Kristen, do you have any words to add?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, all right. Process of bringing these stories together. I am truly an advocate of sitting down and eating with people that I've never sat down and ate with before, and also making sure that I eat some of what they offer as well as what I offer. How did that really impact all of these wonderful, the artistic expression and bringing it all together and eating all those meals and really emoting with the people over food, because I think that's important.
Yeah, I think that was kind of key to the success of it, to be honest. Because a lot of people were really scared. You know, when you show up to a farm in this day and age with a camera,
Exactly.
it is not a popular thing to do. And people were nervous, they didn't trust us. And so I think that by starting with a conversation and usually some kind of shared meal, that created a space where we could get to know each other. And sure, that required us giving something and them giving something in that dialogue, but that was really key to people letting us capture them. And you know, with the camera, it was, I think it's really key to the success of beginning with that shared meal and that shared experience of being together.
Who did you find the most reluctant out of any of the stories to really open up and share their passion about their food and their journey with it? Anyone?
Well, there was a variety of different types of reluctance.
Okay.
You know, I think Hoosiers to begin with tend to be pretty self-deprecating to a fault. I mean, we tend to be far more modest than we need to be in terms of a lot of our own accomplishments. So, you know, I'm not exactly sure why that is, but certainly there are situations where people are just not used to being, they're not used to being interviewed. That is, to the idea of being interviewed. But you know, at the same time, it's a paradox because they may be a little off-put by the idea of the media, but at the same time, when you give people a chance to tell their stories,
They want to tell.
they really want to tell their stories. And when they realize that you're going to listen to them, and when you're able to establish the level of trust that enables them, for whatever reason, to think that, in fact, you are going to listen to them, then things begin to happen. Great things begin to happen. And revelations begin to proceed from there. I mean, I don't need to tell anybody in this room about Studs Terkel, for example, but I grew up in Chicago listening to Studs on the radio and listening to him interviewed. And I think, you know, I'd like to think that that kind of experience became something that was very internalized for me.
Okay.
I think about Studs. I had 2 of Studs' books on my desk as I worked on this project.
Oh, okay.
And so, you know, I remember him talking about how he always liked to fumble with his tape recorder before he began an interview, because when he'd get his subject to help him figure out how to work his machine, they immediately created a rapport.
Exactly.
And he stepped back. He was no longer the person who was in charge of the interview. He was the person that was the listener. I found his process to be really congenial, and I hope that it's reflected in this book. If anything, for me, this book is an homage to him.
Oh, great, great, great. Kristen, anything to add to that? No.
No, I don't think so. I think you got it.
Can we hear some stories?
Yes,
Oh.
well, I have a couple that I want to
Yeah.
touch on. So what was the Spanish word of the day when you went to Cali and Cuban cuisine?
I can take this one.
This happens,
Well,
I just perused a little. This happens to be a Cuban restaurant in Indiana, and they're refugees or
yeah, so this is
immigrants.
actually one of my favorite stories.
And so what they do is, because they also want to share who and what they are, they have a Spanish word of the day that they put on display. And for people who either know it, they get a free meal or something free.
Free drink.
But what it is, it's teaching as well as sharing. And he says that he looks for some of the harder Spanish words so that you aren't coming in there and talking about mucho gracias, you know.
That's them.
There you go. Yeah.
Timely kismet, I tell you.
That's right.
Kristen.
Well, I'll give a quick overview of their story because I think it's fabulous. This is Gus and Yali. That was Gus and Yali. They own a Cuban sandwich shop in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And Gus was a journalist in Cuba. And he wrote a couple of pieces that did not sit so well with Castro. And he and Yali were forced to leave the country. They had no experience with cooking until they opened up their sandwich shop, and it is an incredible place. It's real. You can feel the sense of community and exactly what you were talking about with it being educational as well as communal, and people gather there and they're happy, and there's just this really great energy throughout the place. And the word of the day when we were there, I don't remember what it was, but we just did a signing there, and we're thrilled that they used Libra, which is the word for book.
Great. Now, Dave, do you have a favorite story or group or person that you spoke with that just really stands out? Because I've got another one I can.
I've got a lot of them, but one of the portraits that's flashing up there is a picture of a fellow named Joe Moscovitch, who is a native of New Orleans.
Okay.
Grew up in New Orleans. His dad was an oysterman. Joe was at one time the owner of the largest restaurant in the city of New Orleans, a city of great restaurants, a place called Visco's, 500 tables. Had it, lost it. Went up to Lexington, Kentucky, opened a Cajun Creole place there, had great success with it, lost it. Wound up working his way gradually north to Indianapolis, where he says he found himself on what he considers the best corner in the world.
Okay.
Just 54th and College in Indianapolis on the north side. Opened a place called Yats, and has had great success there, and let's hope it just continues on for him. But Joe is an exemplary host, is the way I would describe him. And he really speaks in his interview to what food can do for us, what the gathering that takes place around food can do for us. And he's got one of my favorite lines in the book in which he says something to the effect that, if they'd had restaurants way back then, it wouldn't have taken them so long to invent the wheel.
I guess so, because you have to figure out how to get there.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to throw another one out, and this is because the name is close to me. Back in my old days when I worked for the Chicago Reader newspaper for a long time in my life, one of my boss's last name was Yoder. And of course, he came from Indiana, and he came from a Mennonite family. So of course, in the book, you have Sharon Yoder, and she grows popcorn, and I hear popcorn is one of the cash crops of Indiana. Can you give me a little bit more about that?
Well, popcorn is a big deal in Indiana. I mean, you know, Orville Redenbacher is from Indiana, for
Okay, I
example.
didn't know that.
So, yeah, popcorn's a big deal. It goes back a long, long way. There's popcorn, there's also kettle corn. That's a traditional Indiana treat. Sharon Yoder has been running one of the oldest and one of the most popular popcorn brands in Indiana. Her family's been involved with it for a very long time. She's up in northeastern Indiana. But you know, it turns out, I mean, there's so many crops that we discovered, or so many food products we discovered in Indiana that surprised us. For example, mint. I had no idea that northern Indiana is to mint what Burgundy is to wine. I mean, mint tasters from all over the world go to this particular point in northern Indiana to sample the mint oils to find it, because they're the purest, they're the richest. In fact, Wrigley spearmint and double mint gums wouldn't exist without Indiana mint. That's where it started. That's where it started. Mr. Wrigley came and tried the mint in northern Indiana. So that's extraordinary. Another thing, I mean, another example, I had no idea. If you drive across Indiana for any length of time, I mean, you're always kind of inundated or overwhelmed by looking at the massive fields of commodity crops, corn and soybeans. But Indiana's #1 food export is actually duck. Indiana exports more ducks than any place else in the United States. If you eat duck in a restaurant anywhere in America, it's a 50-50 chance that you're eating duck from Indiana. Indiana is exporting enormous numbers of ducks to China. It's mind-blowing.
Great, they're buying from us.
Yeah, exactly.
Good thing.
So I mean, you know, I had no idea about that. So those are just some examples. You know, central Indiana is on the same latitude as Tuscany in Italy.
Okay.
Our tomatoes are fantastic.
Okay.
You know, I don't know why we don't make a bigger deal of it. But, you know, we ran into a story in Montgomery County in Indiana not too long ago on a book tour, and a person came up to us and told us a story about this Italian farming family that about 5 years ago bought property in Montgomery County and moved from Tuscany to Indiana to raise tomatoes.
Okay.
Incredible stuff. Yeah, great stuff.
Well, I would just say, if they need extra mint, they can come to my yard, because you know it's nothing but me. But do we have any questions from the audience, since we're losing some of you? Yes, ma'am.
Could you say more about the link between food and the humanities, and how the Humanities Council in Indiana came up with or responded to a proposal for food for thought? It's not what most people first think about when they think about the humanities.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it started through the leadership of my bosses. She took over the organization and really wanted to focus on the public humanities. And her name is Kira Amstutz. And she's actually in town right now. We're here for Chicago Ideas Fest as well. But anyway, she really wanted to figure out a way to address the public humanities. And food is one of the #1 ways that we could dream it up. You know, it's the best way to get people to connect and to begin that conversation. And so that was how it was born, to think of something that was as accessible as possible, and that we could connect as many groups and outside partner organizations as we could.
So the idea was focusing on the humanities as something that gets people to connect?
The convening aspect of the humanities, yeah. But in addition to that, we acquired all of these food-related books to start book clubs and get people talking, and we had a traveling exhibit that allowed people to tell stories. It's kind of like StoryCorps. And those kinds of things that kind of teased out from that beginning. But yeah, it just started with the convening aspect of it. I think right now, we're a really divided society in a lot of ways. And so through coming up with a topic that everyone can connect to, that was kind of where it began.
Any more questions? We got a mic coming. Hold on.
Just wanted to go back to what you just mentioned. I like the book and the idea behind the food and how it connects people. And how it also looks like, you know, we're reaching out to our neighbors to see what they eat and reaching out to see what might they help, needs that they may have through the dinner parties that we mentioned earlier. And then the ducks, that's so interesting. Our neighbors in China, maybe we're importing to them more because they have the radiation thing going on, or the catastrophes that they've witnessed. And so I just wanted to raise that thought, that's possibly why. And just a little bit of what I know, that a lot of the farmers in China are committing suicide because they're feeling like the land is no longer workable. So yeah, it's really good that we bring more attention to taking care of our Mother Earth, and how we get nutrition from that. So, but do you think that maybe that's why there's more imported ducks in China, or to China from Indiana?
That's a really good question. I wish I had the answer for that. You know, I think that these folks have a tremendous appetite for duck. And, you know, we hope that, of course, the ducks that they're importing are healthy ducks, are good for them.
All right, another question here.
How did you actually pick the participants? I assume you had a bigger pool and then narrowed it down. Did they volunteer? Did you?
No, nobody volunteered per se. I mean, and then everybody did. I mean, we had to ask, we had to solicit every interview. I mean, we had a great head start because of the Food for Thought program, which had been going for 2 years. Through that, the Indiana Humanities had been able to develop a great network of contacts all over the state with people who were involved with food in a variety of capacities. After that, we just did our own research. I mean, you know, we added our own research to that, reading as much as we could, going through those guidebooks and best of books to try and find where it seemed like the most resonant stories might be. We talked to folks, everybody from people in the Department of Agriculture to food writers. We relied a lot on word of mouth. And we developed a list that was, you know, 3 or 4 times larger than the list we ultimately had. But as I mentioned to Coco, I mean, we had a lot of criteria that had to be met. So we were looking for great stories. We were looking for great geographic distribution. We were looking for great cultural diversity among the folks, and a wide range of different occupations. So, you know, that was really probably the hardest part of the project, was coming up with that list of about 80 or 90 people. And then we just got on the phone. I called everybody up one at a time and started, you know, creating lists of interview dates. And then Kristen and I hit the road and traveled all around the state and went to all of these folks. That was the key. We wanted to be there in people's own environments where they were. I mean, there's Greg Gunthorpe, and you can tell that's just before Thanksgiving.
They're not ducking and hiding.
Yeah. Greg Gunthorpe, by the way, you know, has made, I think, New Reader's list of the top 25 most influential people in Chicago food, because he is supplying turkeys, ducks, chickens, and pork to a lot of the best restaurants here in town. He started by purveying for Charlie Trotter. Went from Charlie Trotter, now he's purveying to Rick Bayless, the chef at the Ritz-Carlton, and on and on and on. You know, very interesting.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, we found people to be really accessible and excited about participating. It wasn't difficult to get to people or to hear their stories, which was really nice.
Any more questions? No? Maybe so. 1, 2, 3, 7.
So were those people told that you were writing a book?
Oh yeah, yeah. Sure, and you know, everybody signed releases, etc., etc. Yeah. No, that's why people at first were sometimes like, me? You want to talk to me? You know, you want me to be in a book? I mean, that was kind of like the first hump that had to be gotten over, because people were not always completely sure. They wanted to tell their stories, but they weren't exactly sure why they were being recognized.
Okay. Well, one question, the distinctions in your table of content are purposeful. Place, risk, passion, starting over, back to the roots. Can you please help us interpret these?
Well, when we began the project, we created a structure.
Okay.
And the structure was simply geographic. I mean, it was as simple as that. Okay, we're going to organize the book according to southwestern Indiana, southeastern Indiana, central Indiana, northeast, northwest, etc. That turned out to be a good structure for going about the business of collecting our materials. But once we had those materials in hand, we realized that that was a pretty arbitrary way to think about things. And in fact, once we were actually working with texts, when the interviews were actually on paper and we could begin to hear these voices again, we began to realize that there were a lot more interesting ways to think about these pieces, and themes began to emerge. You know, for example, there are many folks getting involved with food today. It's a new life for them, quite literally, for a variety of reasons, whether it's because they're refugees or because they have been involved in other professions that are about as far from food as you might be able to imagine, but they have come back to food in different ways. There are a lot of interesting. I mean, we live in a time when we hear a lot about the fragmentation of families and people living farther and farther apart and so on. But in Indiana food, family and family continuity is a large recurring theme. You see that happening again and again, although sometimes it's interesting. The grandparents may be doing something, and this could be farming, this can also be being involved with restaurants too. The grandparents may have done something, the children go off and do something else, but then the grandchildren come back and pick up the thread because they don't want to lose the family farm or the family business or whatever the case may be, and they feel attracted to it. I mean, there are many stories among the pictures that have been flashing on the wall, and as I see them coming up, I think, you know, that evoke that. So those themes began to emerge, and you know, we all sat together and began playing with them and figuring out, you know, a more evocative way to be able to organize the book.
Yeah, and I think it kind of connects to your question about food and the humanities, because that was really the guiding force, these human qualities that brought the stories together and how they wove together, and that, you know, across very different occupations, in fact, occupations where people would probably never sit in the same room together, there were common threads, and I think those are really powerful, and so we thought that was a strength to unite those common shared traits rather than to divide people by things like geography or occupation.
It was great because when we had the book launch in August, we launched the book at the Indiana State Fair.
Oh, best place.
Yeah, while the fair was taking place. And we invited everybody that was interviewed in the book, and marvelously, about half the people that appear in the book all showed up for this big family dinner.
Right.
Many of them bringing their own foodstuffs along with them to share. And, you know, what a great congregation of folks, many of whom, on the surface at least, would not appear to have a whole lot in common. But, you know, it was great. It was like being at a high school reunion. Everybody wanted to sign each other's books. You know?
Memorialize this.
Yeah.
Okay, great. The one last thing that I'm going to bring up that's from the book is you did mention that every place you went, you ate. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, but you always had dessert. Tell me about some of those good desserts.
Oh gosh, well, you know, you see a picture of a pie coming up. That's Elaine Jones. She's an Amish chef from northeastern Indiana, around Topeka, Indiana, in LaGrange County.
Okay.
Elaine has a big dining hall, and you can hire that dining hall, and she will cook for large groups of people. Those are pretty great. There's Joe Moscovitch, the guy from New Orleans. He's got some great desserts. I mean, Lisa Harris, what a great story. She is the head of the public hospital in Indianapolis, Wishart Hospital. They're building a new building, and she's creating a sky farm on the top of the hospital, has been offering vegetarian dishes in the hospital cafeteria. They all sell out. They all sell out. They can't keep them in. She's actually, I mean, she's going to redefine how we think about hospital food. I mean, it's really, it's really cool.
It's so necessary.
That's off the subject of dessert, though.
That's okay. It took us to where we're supposed to go. That's how it always is. Basically, we're getting to the close of our discussion. Are there any last words that you would like to say to sum up your feelings about your project and your book and all that's happened?
I'll just include one more thing, which
Please
is that for me, the dessert was
Okay.
the stories and the richness of it. And I think that just, if there's one thing to take away from this, it's the stories. And, I'm sure infinitely many exist here. I mean, the Chicago community is unbelievable. But it was really, truly life-changing, hearing stories and creating that space. So thank you for having us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, this is not a best of book. And, some of these people are doing really incredible things, but there are many others. And hopefully what this book does is, as you go through it, it makes you think of your own stories about food. It makes you think about your own connections and the people that have been in your life who have served you a meal at one time or another. The conversations you've had around the dinner table. I hope the book gets people thinking along those lines and inspires them to be more aware about the food stories in their own communities.
Well, there are just two things I'd like to leave you with, which are things that I deeply feel about food. I am a chef. I've been cooking since 7. I went to chef school at 40s. I've been a chef over 20 years, just to give you an idea. So food's been a great part of my life. I was lucky enough to have a grandmother who had a farm in South Haven, Michigan. And being a city girl, I was able to go to her farm in the summer and hated it. Hated it. I had to feed chickens, I had to slaughter hogs, I had to go pick this. But once I became a chef and really got into food, I realized how valuable that foundation was. Because I, as a city person, had a connection to real food. And I think that's what's missing. Dave mentioned one thing that's always on my mind, and that is that cooking is becoming a lost art. We've got to get back to cooking at least one small meal, breakfast or brunch once in a while. But we need to pass on to our children how to bring a meal together. Because cooking is not just about cooking, it's also a spiritual experience. And since I'm talking about it as a spiritual experience, my other very deeply held thought is that food is our first connection to the universe. It's our first. The food comes from it, it nourishes us, it's our first connection to the universe. And it's our consistent connection to the universe and what it has to offer. That's why we have to make sure we save our planet. Because if we don't save it, it can't save us. But remember, that food you eat every day was created by a power greater than all of us. And it was created to nourish our bodies so that we can continue to walk each day into the greatness that is ours to have. So remember, cook, learn how to cook something from scratch, from fresh. Because I think that, in essence, is a prayer to whomever your God may be, that you appreciate this gift that they have left for us. Because it's not going anywhere, just like we are. But we've got to change our relationship to it and make sure we touch what we put in our bodies first, and not a whole lot of other people who don't know us, don't like us, and could care less. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to go over a few announcements, and I want to start by thanking Coco and Kristen and David for